Mr. Foxman, my question basically is, my perception over most of my life, certainly the last 25 years of my life, is that most groups that have suffered some form of oppression seems to, and you used the term several times in your remarks, you used the term good people. You used the term good people over and over again. And it seems that in our response to these afflictions, we tend to forget about the good people. And we only tend to focus in on that small group of people who, no doubt, inflicted an enormous amount of pain. But it seems to me that healing, moving forward, and getting beyond this is pretty much to focus on the larger group, which are the good people. That's where the solution is. And I say this as a black man, it appears to me that we don't do that. I mean, when are we going to start focusing on the good people?
Okay, well, okay, thank you. I would say I think that's what we try to do. If I did not believe that we can change people's minds and hearts, I wouldn't go to work in the morning. If I didn't believe that we can bring about epiphany of people, educate them, sensitize them, I would not be doing what I'm doing in 45 years. Here's the challenge. Yes, and again, I'm an optimist. You know, I'm an optimist by virtue of the fact that I'm here, that I survived, and I know that even in the midst of evil in the Holocaust, there were, as Diane said, the Bratislava Corpus. There weren't enough Bratislava Corpus because if Juan Raoul Wallenberg could save 100,000 human beings, can you imagine if there were 100,000 Raoul Wallenbergs, we wouldn't have a Holocaust. Now, but you're absolutely right. But the problem is that the bigots operate 24/7, and the good people are out there waiting for somebody to do it. George, ADL, AIPAC, World Council, I don't know. And our challenge is to find the way to trigger the good people, which are the overwhelming majority, to, you know, if not 24/7, to wake up, to respond, to do. If you would say to me, you know, so what does the ADL do? What lesson for me? What I think we are trying to find are the trigger mechanisms to stimulate, to sensitize, to inspire, to the good people to stand up. And again, when I said stand up to say no, it's the overwhelming majority. But we saw, again, I go back to the Holocaust, we learned that whenever good people said no, people lived. Jews lived, gays lived, gypsies lived. So, but there they were, millions of people who didn't do anything. Millions of good people who didn't do it. The ones that collaborated were a small group. And the ones who stood up were even smaller. And yet, they were all good people. And yet, they were all good people. And, you know, I have my own little dream. My dream is, I've sort of not given up, but I used to think that we can find a vaccine against prejudice. And on one hand, when you think that we've conquered time and space, reached the moon, we've eradicated smallpox, polio, we've transplanted the heart, why can't we find an antidote and a vaccine against hate or bigotry? To maybe the good people don't need it, but maybe they do. And now I'm somewhat, my little dream is, we're into DNA. And I know a lot of people worry about DNA and cloning, but maybe the DNA would be able to identify why Bratislava Corpi, who could barely read and write, had the courage to stand up and say no to the Nazis and Gestapo and risk her life to save another human being. What made people bystanders? What made people courageous? So I believe it's out there, and I believe we're going to find it. someday. But you're absolutely right. We need to focus on the good people, but at the same time, we don't have the luxury to ignore the ugly people, the evil people, the hateful people. And sometimes you need to focus on them to wake up the good people. Hey, to say to them, you can't just stand by. You need to be educated, and you need to educate. The good news is you're not born a bigot. The bad news is you learn to be a bigot. The second bad news, it's much quicker to learn to be a bigot than to unlearn to be a bigot. But it's in the hands of the good people. But you've got to motivate them. You have to find those trigger mechanisms. And I guess if you came here, I don't sing, I don't tell jokes. So you came because you care. And part what we're about is, in a very simple way, to say to the good people, you have a responsibility, and the responsibility is as simple as standing up, and I don't think it's always simple, but let's say as simple as standing up and saying no. And if not all of them, but many of them would, boy, things would begin to change in terms of civility and respect in our country and beyond.
You were pretty close to Pope John II, John Paul II, and you had interviews with Benedict XVI. You can't hear me? I can holler. Okay. You have met with Pope John Paul II and with Benedict XVI. Have you ever discussed with them their attitudes toward Israel and towards the survival of the Jewish people? And if so, what were their differences?
Okay, it would be arrogant for me to say I was close to John Paul. One can aspire. I've had the privilege to be with him in his presence, to speak to him on 8 occasions. The importance of John Paul was that he changed 2,000 years of teaching of contempt. Vatican II made some specific, very significant changes in the relationship between the Jewish people and the Catholic Church and the Vatican. But what John Paul did was, I would say, very, very courageous. Probably the most important thing that John Paul did was to go to synagogue. The visit of the synagogue was the most important theological statement that the Church engaged in over 2,000 years. By the Pope going to a synagogue, he basically said to the Christian world that Christianity did not supersede Judaism, which is what used to be taught, that God's promise and covenant with Abraham was not superseded by his covenant with Jesus, that Judaism is a viable religion, and therefore he went to participate, to sit, to bear witness to the vitality of Jewish life. And that symbolically, if you will, even theologically, was very, very important. Then, he talked about the Jews being the elder brother. He talked about anti-Semitism being a sin. His visit to Jerusalem, recognizing, going to the wall, going to Yad Vashem, apologizing for the history of the teaching of contempt. I would share with you just an insight into the sensitivity of the man. I know a family in Rome who's lived in Rome for several hundred years, and one day a phone call was received by that family. The Pope wants to see them, and they went to see the Pope. And the Pope said, "I understand that you are a close friend, childhood friend of the chief rabbi, Rabbi Toaf. I have decided," the Pope said, "that I would like to visit the synagogue. But I don't want to put the rabbi in a position where he has to say yes. So if I would call him as the Pope, or I would write him, he would have to sort of say yes. So I've asked you, tell the rabbi that I would like to visit the synagogue, if he wants me to, if he's comfortable. Message was carried. The rabbi sent a message back to the Pope saying, I need a week. In that week, he polled the rabbis of Europe because he felt this was not his own decision. And the majority of the rabbis in Europe said, yes, welcome. But the sensitivity of this man to ask whether it would be comfortable and accepting. By the way, Rabbi Toaf is mentioned in John Paul's will by name. Now, you ask the difference. The difference is in style. Everything that John Paul did had to have the acquiescence of Benedict, who was Cardinal Ratzinger, who was the keeper of the faith. He was the defender of the faith. This was the partnership. The Pope was the public voice and figure, but any changes or any nuance in the dogma, anything to change, had to have Ratzinger's approval. So that everything that was done had this current cardinal's approval and acquiescence. And what was important in the sense of this, and again, it's a different style, it's a different ethnicity, it's primarily personality differences. But what was also important, because a lot of people said, well, that was John Paul because he was Polish and he grew up in Poland during the Holocaust, and that's almost an aberration. What's important about Cardinal Benedict is that he institutionalized the things that John Paul did in changing the relationship between Jewish people and the Christian Catholic world. And if you watch, he follows in his footsteps. He visited the synagogue in Rome. In every country that he goes, he visits a synagogue. He was in New York. He visited a synagogue. He meets with the Jewish community. So again, to indicate that this changed relationship is not ad personam John Paul, but it is institutional. And so people are ready to criticize, but they're criticizing his style, not the substance of the relationship. And if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, the most dramatic change in 2,000 years is the change of the attitude between the Catholic Church and Judaism. Because, unfortunately, it was for many, many years the ones that legitimized. So this is the most dramatic change in anti-Semitism. So now we have another issue. Now we have the issue with Islamic fundamentalism. That's become the new vehicle for anti-Semitism, whether it's Iran, whether it's Hamas, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's the extremists who have hijacked Islam in its radical, and that today is the greatest anti-Semitic vehicle and conveyor. But it's no longer what it used to be. It's now a new challenge. But this current Pope certainly is carrying on the tradition of John Paul in the relationship with the Jewish people.
I don't know very much about the Armenian and Turkish situation, but the first questioner was asking you about the Jewish opinion of the situation, and I am asking you if the massacre that the Armenians suffered, to use your word,